Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the properties of real numbers. We're not going to do all the numbers. These are a select few that I'm going to pick that I think are most important for my math class. So let's go with the first one, which is an easy one. It's the distributive property. Distributive property we've seen a lot. It's when you have a parentheses, such as this, and you take the number on the outside and you distribute it to everything on the inside. So 3 times 4 is 12x, and 3 times 2 is 6. Once you distribute it, the parentheses goes away. The only thing to keep in mind with the distributive property really is if you have a negative number on the outside of a parentheses, for whatever the reason may be, if it's as long as it's negative, we'll do 3x plus 6, and you distribute that. Just remember you're distributing this negative as well. So that's negative 4 times 3 is negative 12x, and negative 4 times positive 6 is negative 24. That's the hardest part about the distributive property. The next property we're going to do is the associative property. The associative property, there's two different properties. There's one for associative property of addition. There's one for associative property of multiplication. So the associative property basically says that if you change the groups, that if we have a group here, 3 plus 4 plus 5 is the same as 3 plus 4 plus 5, right? The change in the parentheses with addition, it doesn't change your answer. This is called the associative property of addition. Change in the parentheses doesn't change the answer. This is the same as this. Multiplication is the same, except instead of the groups being around addition, they're around multiplication. Again, this is going to give you the same answer as this, associative property of addition, and this will give you the same answer as this. Right? 3 times 4 is 12, times 5 is 60. 4 times 5 is 20, times 3 is 60. That's all the associative property does. Change the groups and you still get the same answer. Change the groups and you still get the same answer. We'll go over, I'll write it down at the end in one frame to make it a little bit easier. So next we have the commutative property. Again, there's one for commutative property for addition, and there's a commutative property for multiplication. So the commutative property just says that if you change the order, the result is the same. Right? The order changed, but you still get the same answer. This is with addition, and the same is true for multiplication. 2 times 3 times 4 is the same as 3 times 2 times 4. Right? The order changed, but the answer is the same. These are the same. That's the commutative property of multiplication. The next one we're going to do is the identity property. Now we get a little bit harder. The identity property, there's one for plus and there's one for multiplication. The identity property says that the number doesn't change. So 3 plus 0 equals 3. This is the identity property. When you add 0, the number doesn't change. This is the identity property of addition. Negative 4 plus 0 equals negative 4. X plus 0 equals x. No matter the value of x, if you add 0 to it, the number doesn't change. For multiplication, to get the number to not change, you multiply it by 1. 3 times 1 is 3. Negative 6 times 1 is 6, negative, right? Multiply by 1, the number doesn't change. This is identity. The number doesn't change. So the inverse, remember in math, inverse means opposite. So the inverse, again, there's an inverse of addition and there's an inverse of multiplication. So the inverse property, if you add the opposite, you'll get 0. That's the inverse property of addition. Adding the opposite will give you 0. With multiplication, you multiply by the inverse. The inverse of 4 is 1 over 4. And you get 1. The inverse of negative 6 is negative 1 over 6. Alright, you're multiplying the opposite. Multiplying the opposite. The inverse of 1 over 2, remember you just flip them, so it would be 2 over 1, and your answer is going to be 1. Alright, our next one, and the last one for these is the zero product property. The zero product property says that any number times 0 is 0. No matter the number. Any number times 0 is 0. That's the zero product property. Even has product in there, which as we know means multiplication. Alright, here's the handy one page of all the properties. Distribute, you distribute the outside to the inside. The associative property says that grouping doesn't matter. Commutative property says that the order doesn't matter. And the identity property says the number doesn't change. And the inverse, you're doing the opposite operation. These 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, all have an addition and a multiplication. Associative property of addition, associative property of multiplication. These 4, inverse of addition, inverse of multiplication. But the basic rule stays the same for both. And then the last one is the zero product property. It's where you multiply by 0. Anything multiplied by 0 is 0. Alright, we're also going to review the properties for equations or inequalities. An equation, remember, an equation has the word equals in it. Right, equals. So an equation has an equal sign. An inequality is going to have some sort of either less than, greater than, or a less than, an equal, or a greater than, or equal. These properties are done to both sides of either the equal sign or the inequality sign. Something that's done to both sides. There's basically only 4 of them. They're not hard. You just have to remember what they're called. So let's just do 2 plus x equals 4. So when we're solving this one-step equation, we have to move this positive 2 over. As a review, remember it doesn't have a sign, so it means it's positive. And the opposite of plus 2 is minus 2. So this step here where we subtract 2 from both sides is the subtraction property of equality. I'm just going to write it like this. So whenever you do something to both sides of an equal sign, it's a property of equality. If this was 2 plus x less than 4, and we still do the same thing, we draw our line here, this would be a subtraction property of inequality. But the basic idea is the same. If you're doing something to both sides, then it's one of these properties. And you're basically only doing 4 things to both sides. You're basically doing just one of 4 things for these properties, whether it's an equality property or if I change this to an inequality. You're still basically doing one of these 4. You're doing this, which would be the subtraction property of equality. This one, since you're adding 4, that's the addition property of equality. This is multiplication, so you're going to divide both sides. This is the division property of equality. And this one, since this is division, and the opposite of division is multiplication, so we're going to multiply by the bottom number of this fraction. This multiplying is the multiplication property of equality. These are your properties of equalities or inequalities. Again, if I change these to an inequality sign, like this or this or this or this, then these would just be the subtraction property of inequality instead of equality. The thing to remember with these properties is you have to do it to both sides of the equal mark. I think that'll do it for this video. A little short video, but we covered a lot of material. We just need to make sure we practice identifying these. Practice identifying these properties.